Blah, 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 it is. Okay, so here's the thing. So week 5, right, which is, we're sort of in the middle, just over the middle of it. It's completely a week of work on the discussion board. So basically, the required activities, according to the agenda, is that you review week 4 readings, because those are the ones that this next essay is all about. You do the interaction prompt A by Tuesday, and then B by Sunday, which is basically a revision of Tuesday's work with a little bit extra. And then recommended activities, we all know that. Questions and chat, which is what we're here now. Okay, so I'm going to explain the essay, again, to try to help, because it's, like I said before, it's super easy. So the key to writing this essay is to point out and discuss those external social societal elements that affect the way a person experiences literacy. So institutions exert pressure on people, economic forces do, politics and government does, cultural forces, all of that. So the idea is we're trying to investigate this space where we read and we write, and it's a super internal event, but also it's being influenced by the time that we are living in, the institutions that we're engaged with, the politics that are in power, all of the things. And so it's trying to recognize, it's almost like trying to, lift yourself out of your body and watching yourself and trying to understand sort of the bigger picture. Like, there I am writing this essay or reading this book, and now I can also see that there are other things that are influencing my interpreting of whatever I'm reading, or influencing what I'm choosing to write, or how I'm writing, or whatever I'm talking about. So next thing, excellent numbering, 1. Okay, and then 1. When we read or write, there are factors at work beside just the act of writing or reading, right? So first there are our internal thoughts and thought processes, but there are also other external factors, right? So we do not think in a vacuum, we do not write in a vacuum without any influence. So the idea is we're trying to, I always have this image of a person writing with their head down, like, old school, with a pen and a paper, and like with their head down, and they're writing really vigorously. Instead of that, we're doing this thing where we're like lifting up our head and we're looking around, and then we're writing things, but we're being more aware of what's going on, as opposed to believing that, it's just us and our like thoughts. B, for example, the pressures exerted by institutions, economic forces, politics and government, and cultural forces. So things, just general big idea things that are influencing us, or altering or flavoring, or changing our thoughts when we read, or our meaning, the way we understand something. So here's the important part, and because I was looking at some of the preliminary posts. So you want to make sure that you're identifying actual external forces, and you're trying to talk about how they affect somebody's literary experience, right? I mean, digital literary experience, I suppose. But instead of simply summarizing that people's experience, right? So it's to be like, I read this thing, this digital literacy narrative by somebody who learned how to use Instagram, and so they talked all about how it was great, and they finally were able to like put their clothes that they sew by themselves online, and people really liked it. So there's a summary of a person's experience, right? That's one thing. You're trying to get at the next thing, the sort of deeper thing, which is how are cultural forces interacting with this, right? For example, the idea that you could actually launch a business on Instagram, that people have done it and people make money, or you become famous or semi or whatever, or you get likes and you get that feeling of affirmation. oh my God, man, 1,000 people have read this or looked at this or whatever. Those are the things that you're trying to focus on. You're trying to say, okay, how does that interact with this person's experience? You don't just want to summarize what happens. That's the key. And what we're doing right now, most of us are just summarizing what happens, which is actually fine. We need to know that. But the next step is to be like, okay, so here's this person's experience. They went on Instagram. They were afraid to try to use it. They did it, and then they started to expose stuff that they had created, and then they sort of gained more confidence, and then they started to feel better about themselves, and like this whole thing. You're like, okay, that's great. But then you want to talk about what it is about Instagram and what it is about getting likes or how many followers or viewers and how that affects what people decide to do or not do or whatever. So that's sort of the big main idea, I guess. Okay, so the theory was, yeah, go for it. That's what you're looking for. Yes, I mean that's what you're investigating. You're trying to find out how it is, but it's not just reading and writing because we're trying to extend this a little bit to like digital literacy, right? So digital literacy means you're also like posting on Instagram or having an Instagram account that you pay attention to and post on. That's digital literacy. That's you actually. So instead of writing a paper or reading a book, you're posting on Instagram, right? You're getting pictures and you're cropping them and you're putting them up with little things. Like so that's all digital literacy. And yes, you're trying to then also explain how forces outside of you are, affecting what you're doing. So I want to do this because it's possible, become famous, and I'm going to become famous on whatever. That's a pressure. That's an external thing. So you're right, exactly. The point is to try to find that, um, in the narrative that you found from the archive, right? Which I don't know, maybe, but anyway, that's the idea. You're trying to use since we have very limited sources for this essay, you definitely want to find a narrative, a digital narrative from that archive that will be helpful. So if the one that you picked and that you talked about, it might be fine for the post and get a credit for that. But for this essay, maybe you want to find a different one, just because. So again, digital literacy, right, which is engagement with this digital world, creation in the digital world, and or interpreting of the digital world. Um, and then how different forces, right, are affecting that. So I've been in an example. Like I have Facebook. That's basically the only thing I deal with for real. Not even for real, but okay, say that's it. Right. So I've engaged. I've had fights on with like my cousin, right, on Facebook. So I could talk about this idea that when you're on Facebook, you're sort of protected, obviously, right, by being online. Yeah, I'm not yelling into his face because that would be uncomfortable. Instead, I can type these very intense, insults or whatever I'm doing because I have this shield, and that's something that's affecting what I'm doing, right? The reason that I'm writing this particular thing on Facebook to tell my cousin that he's an idiot is because of this force. I'm, I'm being hidden. It allows me to hide so that I'm bolder and more assertive, which is also why bullying happens and so on. In any event, um, so yes, short answer is that's exactly what you're trying to do. Is you're trying to investigate the different forces that are influencing what you. Because if my memory serves, one of them is trying to talk about reading how to interpret and understand a scientific academic paper, and the other one's sort of busting on that. Is that true? Is that sort of how you read it? Okay. So what I'm thinking is, as I'm finding it, is that the one that's busting on it is doing so because there are these other forces, that this person's appealing to something else, right? They're not just doing a straight up, this is how we do it, and this is what we do, and so on. They're trying to whatever, slightly mock it or whatever, but they're being affected. Their response to the way that you interpret this type of a paper is different than the first person. So you have these two takes on how to read a scientific paper. One of them might have been like, I'm just going to give this information, and one of them might be like, I'm going to point out other stuff, right? Because some other forces are making me do this. Like, I want to be able to be like, hey, here's a stupid thing about this idea, um, or here's a real life way it happens. That's another thing that people do, right? They're like, yeah, we're supposed to be somebody who reads, you know, my history teacher assigned me 350 pages to read, and I read like 7 on the internet about the thing I'm supposed to read, whatever. Like, you're trying to look at the forces. So what I'm saying is, you're trying to figure out a way, as far as we're concerned, um, of how to use those two things as an example to talk about the way that external forces influence the way people write about things. So I think the theory behind in the English department was, we're giving you these two examples, and the idea is that you're trying to use them as examples of the way that exterior forces influence the way people write. Oh, here we go. Right. Oh, I thought it was opposite. That's funny. I forgot. I think the one I thought, the one that was busting on it, I thought was the other one. Okay, so now I get it. Okay, so how to read a scientific paper. So this guy, the first one, he's sort of being not super genuine, I'm assuming. So he's sort of like describing the difficulty of trying to get through reading a scientific paper, right? And like, it doesn't really work, and so he's analyzing it from a different perspective, right? He's not just being like, which the other person sort of is doing, which is like, actually, this is how you really read it. You do this, you do this, you do this, and that's how you extract information. This guy's trying to talk about expectations that people have, that you're supposed to read them and understand these things. Um, Took me more than 2 hours to read a 3-page paper, but this time I actually understood it, and so it's like it involves all. So anyway, the overall idea is that you're trying to use, because we don't have very many sources for this. Like, you're not supposed to be researching. You're trying to use whatever the sources that we have, and so they're giving you this as a way to analyze exterior forces. So why did this person write this? How to read a scientific paper? Like, what's the point of it? What is he trying to demonstrate or show or prove about this paper? That it's impossible, but if you put your mind to it, you can really do it, or whatever. Um, it's ludicrous, but you can also get something out of it. Whatever. He's trying to portray that process in a certain way, and then she's also trying to portray the process in a certain way. Um, and she's trying to be actually very methodical about it. Here's how you understand it. You do this, you do this, you do this. So they want you to use these as examples when you're talking about the way that exterior forces or exterior expectations um, influence what you write. It's like thinking of the purpose of the writing, right? Both of these people have different. They're trying to achieve a different goal, right? They're trying to achieve a different goal, and so they're going about it, in their different ways. But that's in order to that's being influenced by who their audience is, what the goal that they're trying to achieve. So you're just trying to use them as examples. Let me see if this helps this idea. It's tricky, I understand, but I mean, that's the basic answer is that you have both of these things, so that when you're talking about this connection between Hamilton and this the influence of exterior stuff on the writing and reading process, you're supposed to bring these in as an example. For example, this demonstrates how something influenced or caused this writer to focus on the issue in a certain way. I mean, at least what we're supposed to do, because I don't know that it's right, but that's, I mean, the idea is right there, therefore, because we only have, so I think we have 4 sources for this in my mind. We have the Hamilton article. Do we really have 3 now? Thank you. Exactly, right. So yeah, the digital narrative that you're using. Okay, so then I have, so they had this strategy of being like, don't worry about anything, just write your write 2 of your body paragraphs, right? That's what you're supposed to post initially for this week, for Tuesday, and then you're trying to revise them. Because that's another strategy we're trying to get at as far as writing goes. It's often a very, very good idea to deal with sort of the supporting points that you have, and then figure out and deal with the introduction and the conclusion afterwards. But what I thought I would do is like, okay, so since you're supposed to have 2 body paragraphs, you may want to, this is not an official assignment, but it would be smart to sketch out an outline for the rough draft. And so I made this little outline, right? You have your introduction, which is basically, it has to include your thesis statement. And the thesis statement is all about what effect these other social forces have on the literacy experience. Probably I should call it the digital literacy experience. Let's pick 3 because that seems reasonable. So you have 3 main ideas, and so it's about making a connection between some external force and reading or writing, or in our case, learning Instagram or using Facebook or some sort of digital literacy. And then I say, right, you want to find a quote from one of the articles or both or whichever, but it's a repeating pattern. You have a main idea, you explain the idea and the connections that you're making, and then you're trying to use a quote to help you support that. You present it, then you explain it, and then you sort of move on. So anyway, that's the let's say, here's the thing. That's why you do it at the end. Your thesis should be able to represent your complete argument. So, for example, if your essay did some positive, some negative, and then your conclusion sort of showed, then your thesis needs to also do that. And there's ways that you can write a thesis statement that show to both of the ideas. So let me just show you what I mean. Because we're not using, I use this other textbook in my composition class that gives us templates sometimes to help us do that. But you can have a thesis statement that says 2 different things. Yeah. So I would say you want to use the word while. It's one of the sort of templates for talking about see, but the thing is, I'm wondering, I sort of want to stick, let me see what the official assignment is. Because if it's supposed to be digital narrative, then we're not really just talking about reading and writing, right? So part of what we're doing here is we talked about literacy narratives, that's correct, but we're now talking about digital literacy. Right, so you did your digital literacy narrative, but now we're talking about digital literacy. So that's why I keep bringing up the Instagram idea. So it's actually not that much different. I just want to make sure that we include it. So I'll rephrase my thing. Possibly, yeah, I could see how that would work. I mean, because right, then you're talking about doing those things digitally. If that makes sense to you, I think you could totally do that. That's true. Yeah, you're kind of right. You're kind of right about that. Yours, yeah, no, yours work. I think that yours might be the way to go in the sense that you're going to talk about reading and writing in the digital environment, right? So maybe that's, yeah, I would say, yeah, you're right, because the science papers, I don't know, they still use them, but right, those are mostly like just about reading, right? But then you have your digital thing, but yeah, I would say that's the way to go. So if that's clear, well, it's tricky, yeah, but as far as you're correct, as far as their sources go, they don't. I mean, they're still using this like they're still using reading and writing essentially, right? Which makes it sort of tricky to like expand it out, even though we did digital literacy. So maybe okay, I would say yes. That's a great way to think of it actually. Let me see if I can, yeah, yeah, I think that's better. So I'm going to review right. Here's our essay two topic. Right. So write an essay that presents your perspective on these questions. So reading is a private individual act that happens inside our heads. How does that privacy and individuality relate to the social ecosystem that surrounds reading? When an individual sits down to read something, how do individual thoughts and experiences relate to her social context? Yeah, you're totally right. I would say then yes. I mean, if you can make it, I mean, they're really sort of stepped off of, so that might be my own misreading of the actual assignment. But that might be my own mistake. Yeah, I think I'm going to step back from that and just say you basically want to focus on reading and writing. Because it looks like it's sort of confusing, right? Because the digital archive, right? Remember, we talked about that last week. The digital archive of literacy narratives. And I was like, well, you want to find one that has digital about it. But actually, perhaps for this essay, you're really just dealing with literacy narratives. We're not. Yeah. No, you're totally right. I think so. I'm thinking that, right, you don't even, I think you approach it just with reading and writing. And if you want to sort of, one of the forces that's, exists could be technology also, right? But clearly the focus is going to be on how someone reads and how they interpret something that they're reading, how somebody writes and how they, what they decide to write. So you're right. I think it's a step back. I guess I sort of assumed that they were extending the digital um, literacy idea. So I think, okay, we get rid of that, and this makes way more sense in the sense that we're just going to deal with reading and writing, and now we're like, okay, so um, in reading and writing, how does the social environment affect things, or cultural environment? And a great move would be to talk about how the digital environment affects that, because that's true, right? Think of texting, right? I'm going to go out on a limb and say many people don't use correct punctuation when they text. There we go. So, but I'm saying like, so the reason that you don't do that is because texting is an influencer on what you're saying, and it gives you these other tools. So I'll just use an emoji or whatever. So that's a way to get it in there. But I'm not. Yeah. So it's one of the things, but I'm not going to. That would be a good connection to make, right? Because we're talking about, all right. So what influences people when they're reading and writing? And there's the so this is like, right. So I just did this great sentence. So while each writer and reader expresses ideas that develop inside their own thinking, there are several external forces that can affect the way a person interprets what they read or affects the decisions. Well, no, if I worded it like this, what I would do in my paper, I want whatever my thesis is. So if this is my thesis, it's also presenting the order in which I'm going to talk about stuff. So I would actually start with the writer and reader expresses ideas that develop inside their own thinking. So I deal with this concept of individuality, and when you're reading, you're by yourself, and so on and so on, and when you're writing, so I would start with that, and then I would get into, okay, but that's true, but here are these different external forces, and you said a couple of them. You said a cultural one, I think. um, but anyway, yeah, so when you're doing your thesis, always for any paper ever, right, the order in which you present ideas is the order in which you should develop them in the paper. That's just one of the little things that makes it. Yeah. Oh yeah. This is just so. If this is my thesis statement, this is coming at the end of my introductory paragraph. And what's happening before that are the things that we went over before, right? So like a sentence that sort of um, grabs someone's attention, and then a statement that introduces sort of the broad subject that you're going to be dealing with, and then I'm trying to think what else. Well, that's about it. I mean, you're trying to set the context and background information. Where did I put for that one I didn't. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, but you want to yeah, that's the tricky thing. Let's see if that is. Let me find that. No, but you don't need the definition of digital literacy, but there is that. So Hamilton's article is, even if you're not doing digital literacy, you still need to get to the idea of literacy, right? So you will define what you mean by it, give background of it. So Hamilton's article might be, it wouldn't be, right? You have a hook of some sort. Again, the hook has to do with, right, a question you ask or just something interesting. Um, a little story. You want to define the main terms that you're going to deal with, and that would have to do with um, literacy. And then you have the background, introduce the idea of influence. That's probably what I would do. And then I'd write and probably have to change it all. Yeah. It's better to use, well, that's the thing. I don't want people to find external forces. I mean, external sources in my external sources. Um, so I would rather have you try to use this idea of social context that she talks about, right? So it's not. I would say stick to this because you don't want to bring in another outside source. You want to express or explain or define literacy and the social context based on this article. So I would say stick to this article and this concept of situated social practice, which is sort of the um, sort of like how the way that the influencer, like the external influencers, cause you to do something or write or read in a certain way. In any event, I would say stick with this. Don't find another source because all you'll do is find some definition from somewhere that I don't, that may or may not be super legitimate. And since this is really the basis of what they want the paper to be about, um, broader social context in which literacy is used. Right? I mean, she spends a lot of time trying to be specific and give some examples, but her thing is very much like society and the social situation and the cultural situation influence the way that we understand what we read and influence the way that we write, the decisions we make. So I would say it would be better to use a definition that you put together and support it with her article would be the best case. Right. No, but I think that's what you're saying is that you think there's a difference? Because I'm sensing that those are sort of like she's sort of saying the same thing. She's talking about context, right? That yes, there's a context about when the writer wrote something, there's a context around what that writer wrote. Then there's also a context around you when you're reading whatever it is that you're writing, whatever you're reading. And her main idea is that you want to pay attention to that and identify how that affects how somebody writes and also how somebody reads. Meaning you can't really, I'm just extending it a little bit, but you can't completely understand very completely what somebody wrote unless you also understand the context in which they wrote it. And you don't really understand what you have been reading unless you pay attention to the context in which you've read it. I think that's the theory that we're sort of operating on. And it sounds like that's what you were saying. So I don't think that you have a anyway, that's how, yeah, go for it. Yes, but the way you understand things is influenced all by context and social stuff, right? It's just like a little kid, right? So a little kid learns how to read, and they could read, at a young age, like a whole little child's book and not understand any of it, right? Because they don't really understand. They now know. So there is this like mechanical part of reading and mechanical part of writing. That's absolutely true. And you're right that there is an internal voice also, right, inside people's minds. But she's saying that you also want to take into account, now that we're not kids or whatever, the external forces. Like I do understand what you mean, but being literate is not the same as investigating the meaning of literacy, right? So you're trying to take it a step further. Being literate, you're right, means basically reading and writing with some understanding of both of the things that you're doing. And she's trying to say, okay, but really the next move would be reading and writing and understanding what I'm saying, but understanding what are the things that are influencing me when I'm reading and when I'm writing. Like why, that there is an effect. That I understand a book that I just read in a certain way because it's 2020 and we're in a pandemic and so on and so on, right? Like that, those forces exist in my society, in this culture, in this world that I'm in at the moment. And that is causing me to interpret things in certain ways or understand things in certain ways. Same thing if I write a story right now. I'm going to write a story and then I write it, and the fact that I am where I am at a certain time and so on is influencing what I'm creating. It doesn't mean it's only coming from that. It's not only generated from exterior forces because you have the internal thing. So yeah. Yes, yes, I would think of it that way. Exactly. It's more about the meaning, right? So the connection between literacy and meaning is a big part of this. So when I read something and I'm taking the meaning from whatever I'm reading, in that process of me reading it and extracting meaning, there are forces that are causing me to understand it in a certain way. And then the same thing when I write. So right, it's moving it from literacy being the very basic definition of it to something about where does the meaning come from? The meaning, whether I'm reading or writing, what are all the things that are sort of working? Okay, so for this week though, um, we're looking at all that's left really is to revise or whatever post to. Actually, there's a couple things for it. two body paragraphs, right? So you look at what you've written, if you've posted already for the first draft, right? And now you're thinking, hopefully there's things that are a little bit clearer or something. Sort of revise them. You're posting those, and then you're also posting like a little reflection paragraph, which is where you're explaining what it is you changed from your first one. Like, did you understand something better, or did you make a decision to change something, or whatever? So that's what they're very interested in, this idea that we pay attention to our own process, right? And one of the ways we make people pay attention to stuff is have them write it out. So that's what the second post for this week 5 is supposed to be, the two main body paragraphs that have been rewritten, revised, and then also like just a paragraph about a reflection about your process of revision. What you changed and why you decided to change it, and what you understood that made you want to change it, or whatever. Whole thing. Yeah, that'll be good. Don't worry about it. Right, totally. That's so good. Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, even if people, I'm just again, exactly. That means you're doing it right. I think in my mind. Yeah, totally. So don't worry about, right. Like, it has nothing, no connection with that. That's even better. And then you know what? And when you do your little reflective paragraph, that's exactly a great thing to talk about, right? Just be like, okay, like I changed it completely because here's what my thoughts were, and what I thought then and now. So it gives you at least something to talk about for that. But yeah, it's not a problem at all. It's a good. Well, it's just questions. Let me make sure. It should be. Well, no, the folder only has. That's what's weird. This week only has the agenda, but I did put my the PowerPoint that you just saw is also in the folder. But prompt B says, all right, revise two body paragraphs, blah blah blah. And then it says, explain what you did in your revision and why. Assess your work. What happened? Do you like the results? Do you think another reader would like the results? What went wrong or was unexpected? So that's basically it. Yep, that's it. Yeah, so it's super. It's sort of informal, but it's, see, that would be great. The more you had to change, yours will have, you have stuff to say, which is kind of great, I think. But, so I'll also so I'm just starting. I don't know why I made a whole thing, but I'm just, so under week 5 there is the PowerPoint, and then I did record my talking. So